Now to a historic occurrence at the Vatican today, the first ever meeting between a pope and a president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
After more than 10 years of planning and building, the Rome, Italy temple is ready to be dedicated. But first, President Nelson made a stop at one of the most iconic religious institutions in the world. Just a day before dedicating the new temple, President Nelson traveled to the Vatican for a meeting with Pope Francis.
What a sweet, wonderful man he is, and how fortunate the Catholic people are to have such a gracious, concerned, loving, and capable leader.
President Nelson and President Emerson Ballard of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles spent 33 minutes with the Pope discussing issues the two faiths have in common.
We talked about our mutual concern for the people who suffer throughout the world. We want to relieve human suffering. We talked about the importance of religious liberty, the importance of the family.
They also discussed the youth of the church, the importance of worship, and the work they've done together.
We've been shoulder to shoulder as partners in trying to relieve suffering and trying to help people that are struggling.
The leaders also exchanged gifts.
We gave to him a miniature replication of Thorvaldsen's statue of the Christus, one performed by the Jadro people in Spain. And he gave us a gift of his declaration on the family.
For me, the moment when President Nelson actually embraced the Pope and they gave each other a hug as we left was everything.
A message of peace by Pope Francis ahead of his two-day visit to Morocco. The head of the Vatican is the first pope to visit the North African nation in 35 years.
As Christians and Muslims, we believe in God, the Creator and Merciful One, who has created men and women and lives on the earth so that they may live together as brothers and sisters, respecting each other's diversity and helping each other in their need. He has entrusted the earth, our common home, to them, to care for it and to preserve it for future generations.
The Pope added he will, quote, encourage the progress of the Christian community and to meet the migrants who represent a call to build a world of greater justice and solidarity, end of quote. Pope Francis will be welcomed by some 30,000 Roman Catholics in Morocco who are mostly sub-Saharan African students or migrants heading for Europe. He will hold a mass in Rabat on Sunday and 10,000 faithfuls are expected to attend.
Caro popolo del Marocco, Assalamu alaikum, la pace sia con voi. Tra poco mi recherò nel vostro caro paese per una visita di 2 giorni. Ringrazio Dio per questa opportunità che mi dona. Sono grato a Sua Maestà, il Re Mohammed VI, per il suo gentile invito e alle autorità marocchine per la premurosa collaborazione. Sulle orme del mio santo predecessore Giovanni Paolo II vengo come pellegrino di pace e di fratellanza in un mondo che ha tanto bisogno. Come cristiani e musulmani crediamo in Dio, creatore, misericordioso, che ha creato gli uomini e li ha posti nel mondo perché vivano da fratelli, rispettandosi nelle diversità e aiutandosi nelle necessità. Egli ha affidato loro la terra, nostra casa comune, per custodirla con responsabilità e conservarla per le future generazioni. Sarà una gioia per me condividere con voi direttamente queste convinzioni nell'incontro che avremo a Rabat. Inoltre questo viaggio mi offrirà la preziosa occasione di visitare la comunità cristiana presente in Marocco e di incoraggiare il suo cammino. Come pure incontrerò i migranti che rappresentano un appello a costruire insieme un mondo più giusto e solidale.
Of course, this is a massive event for Abu Dhabi, for the UAE in particular. This is their, quote, year of tolerance. It's an opportunity, of course, to invite His Holiness here to the Arabian Gulf. It's the first time that a pontiff has visited the Arabian Gulf in its history of the Catholic Church, basically. And, of course, he's traveled to other countries. He's traveled to Syria and Lebanon and Turkey as well. But this is the first time that he's come out to the Gulf. And, of course, that means that there's been a lot of emphasis on a message, not just from His Holiness, but also from other religious leaders as well over the last couple of days of peace and tolerance. And we actually saw the pontiff really, hitting out against violence in all its forms and really taking on the traditional narratives around here about Yemen and Syria and what's happening in those countries, and really calling on world leaders and calling on other religious leaders as well to push for peace. But I think it's pretty significant that he would come here and deliver that message while he's staying here in the Arabian Gulf.
Tonight, Pope Francis is midway through a 3-day trip to Turkey, where he's spending time with leaders of other faiths in search of common religious ground.
In a fitting start to a day that focused on interreligious harmony, Patriarch Bartholomew was on hand when Pope Francis arrived in Istanbul. The theme continued in the famous Blue Mosque, where the Pope and the Grand Mufti of Istanbul stood side by side for 2 minutes of what the Vatican spokesman called silent adoration. As the Pope toured the 1,500-year-old Santa Sofia, originally a Byzantine church, then a mosque, and now a museum, the Muslim call to prayer wafted over the city. And in another show of unity, Patriarch Bartholomew attended an unusually lively Mass celebrated by the Pope in one of Turkey's 5 Catholic cathedrals. Whatever else the trip may or may not achieve, Francis has already managed to put moderate Muslims and the Roman Catholic Church in the same camp, as opponents of religious extremism.
One of the things the Pope has spoken about a lot, about what ministers, priests, rabbis, imams could do, is to realize they must bind the wounds of those who are hurt. He always uses this image of the church, particularly as a field hospital, a little like a MASH.
Taking more live pictures from Foundation Hall, where the Pope has just presided over about a 35-minute interfaith ceremony there that really kind of called to people to get along with one another. He really drove home the position of peace and again living with one another in this community, and being able to put your differences aside and live together in harmony.
Well, in his recent encyclical, he talks about interval ecology, how we must create a world, a fabric, a community, and we must be endearing to one another to make the body of the community and the society grow.
Revelation 17 gives further information describing this false religious system, where he says that he saw a great prostitute, which we feel is basically the false church, who sits on many waters. That it means literally many nations, as it's defined later. With her, the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. Now, again, he says he's riding on a beast which has 7 heads and 10 horns. We know that that's the one world empire that's been described earlier. She rides upon it, literally being carried forward by this one world government system. But I find most fascinating is the fact that he refers to himself being greatly astonished as he beheld her in the vision. You see, the term harlot is a frequently used biblical metaphor for false religion. It really is, in a sense, what we would call a prostitution of the truth. a purposeful monetization, if you will, but also the idea to gain more power so that they can, or using religion to gain more power and influence over people's lives. In chapter 17 again, as we just read, there are several identifiers that say that this organization or entity is unique from any others that have gone before. The first of all is there has never been a religious system that has universal authority. It's always been limited by certain boundaries, whether they be geographical or technological or whatever, so that we know that this is something that could not actually be fulfilled until the times in which we're living today. We are, for the first time, living in a universal global system where communication and business have really become a global enterprise, that what happens in China affects us, and believe it or not, what we do here affects them in China. Their income goes up and down. 2008, when we had the Great Recession, so did China have a Great Recession. The difference was they had billions of our dollars that they could pour into their economy to keep it running along, and ended up buying up many. There are really two arguments that are fallacious arguments, but two arguments that are most often employed for the reason of forming one world religious system today. The first is that basically all religions are the same. In fact, Stephen Turner, in his famous poem Creed, kind of in a surreptitious way makes that point. He says, "We believe that all religions are basically the same. They only differ on matters of creation, sin, heaven, hell, God, and salvation. Otherwise, they're exactly alike." Now, even atheists see the problem with this, because Sam Harris, who is well known, he has a book called End of Faith, and he's one of the more famous atheistic writers in the world today. He said, "Many religious moderates have taken the apparent high road of pluralism." We'll explain more what that means. But the high road of pluralism, asserting the equal validity of all faiths. But then he adds, but in doing so, they neglect to notice the irredeemably sectarian truth claims of each. I mean, here's an atheist sitting back saying, how can you miss the fact that they have such broad grounds of disagreement that you can say that they would all come together? And yet, despite the obvious, we find that there is a non-logical approach to this and many other issues, because there's such a desperation in our world today to find harmony. And that's not a bad desire. Let's not mistake. We all want to live in a peaceful environment. We wish we could all get along. But the idea that that's going to happen by simply melding us together religiously seems completely out of reality. The second argument that is used for why we need to have one world religion, or at least harmony amongst them, is that religion is the chief cause of wars and terrorism. In fact, Richard Dawkins, another very famous, wrote the book called The God Delusion, and he's one of the more famous atheists making the rounds these days. He says, if religion were somehow abolished, there would be a much better chance of no more war. He adds, there would be less hatred because a lot of the hatred in the world is sectarian hatred. Now, the problem with men like Dawkins and Harris and many others is they make these very direct assertions that seem to make sense to people who don't know the facts. The facts are completely opposite. In fact, there's one organization called the Institute for Economics and Peace. In 2013, they did a historical survey of past and present conflicts, war conflicts, and they came to an interesting conclusion. They said they found no general causal relationship between religion and conflict. Only 14% of armed conflicts in history have had a religious element to them whatsoever as their main cause. And then they added, quote, having less religion in a country doesn't make it more peaceful. as we can see in our own country, as we move away from faith in Christ and biblical standards, have we become a more peaceful, friendly place to live? Has hatred gone away? In fact, I've never felt such intense hatred as from people who hate religion. Because if you become a hater of religion, then you're free to hate as you please. In fact, the Encyclopedia of Wars basically says very clearly, after an extensive study, they found that only 7% of wars were religious in nature. But you see, it's all a matter of what you want to profile. So if the news media wants to profile religious motivation, let's say, for example, ISIS or groups like that, then they can kind of extrapolate out that that's the general truth that applies to all conflicts. And you may begin to make the fallacious argument that if you remove religion, suddenly we would all get along together. But historically, that's not true. The Norsemen invaded Western Europe not because they had a religious conflict, they invaded it because they wanted their stuff. It's just real simple. And so, basically, again, when Paul says to us that he will send them a powerful delusion, this is one of those powerful delusions. It's one of those lies that people repeat because they've heard it so often they believe it's truth. But actually, when you study the facts, it has no truth in it whatsoever. In fact, faith in God has led to greater peace, not the opposite or other way around. But because mankind is inherently religious, we cannot survive or will never survive without some kind of religious expression. If we go as deep as we can into recorded history, back to the age of the Sumerians in Ur of the Chaldees, where Abraham and his descendants came from, we find the most rudimentary beginnings of religious faith, and it has carried through all of human history. There's not a single period or place on the planet where you could say people were truly atheistic. Now, I know some of you say, well, what about the Soviet Union? That's an interesting point. I remember when we were doing ministry over there, and we were looking at a Soviet youth camp that they were trying to sell. The government was kind of auctioning off all these pieces of property that were no longer used. And it was interesting because as we were walking around the park, we came to around the facility, we came to a little park that with trees and flowers and plants, very well directed, full of all sorts of plaques. And the very first thing it had was the 10 Commandments of communism. I thought, where have I heard that phrase before? 10 Commandments. And then as I walked through, they had various statues where they had like saints being offered, the heroes of the revolution. You see, communist leaders understood very well that people have an inherent religious desire, and they're going to create something to worship. In fact, psychologist Jonathan Haidt, in his book, The Righteous Mind, speaking of this dynamic, said, it's a fact that as humans, we are really good at making something sacred. Maybe it's a rock or a tree or a book, say, the Bible, or a person, Jesus. I don't know, could be. But we make something sacred and we worship it. In other words, I don't agree with his analysis completely, but I would agree with the fact that this is something that is inherent to our nature, because as Solomon said in the book of Ecclesiastes, God has written eternity on our hearts. There's a spiritual awareness that exists in every one of us. And so it's like the atheist who once said, well, I just thank God there's no God. Okay, let's go with that. Now we know we're starting. But if we add to the fact that the Bible foretells us that there's an inevitability of one world religion, if the Bible says it's going to happen, it's going to happen. So we know it's going to take place, and the question we should be really asking is, what exactly is that going to look like? Because, and I say that as something I think is really important, because we can end up being the frog in the kettle. The temperature of the water changes so incrementally that we don't realize how much the world has changed.